Welcome back to Plants of the Gods. In this episode, host Mark Plotkin discusses the crucial role the spice trade has played in shaping global history and culture. Dating back thousands of years, the trade was well underway before the heyday of the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans. During the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it became a primary driver of global exploration and discovery, catalyzing the first wave of globalization with a variety of both positive and negative effects.
Welcome, everyone. This is Mark Plotkin, an ethnobotanist with the Amazon Conservation Team, on the web at www.amazonteam.org, or my personal webpage, markplotkin.com, which features a lot of writings that I haven't published elsewhere. Today I want to talk about the spice trade, the spice of life, how the spice trade built the modern world. The spice trade, a cornerstone of global commerce for centuries, has played a pivotal role in shaping civilizations, economies, and political landscapes. From ancient times to the modern world, the quest for exotic spices has driven exploration, spurred innovation, and fueled conflict. It changed the world in many fundamental areas, including agriculture, cartography, navigation, religion, spycraft, and even major aspects of capitalism as we know it. As a 1998 article in the respected Economist magazine noted, quote, "If history's modern age has a beginning, the spice trade is it. To support this expansion into tropical regions, Europe's merchant classes would invent new forms of commercial credit and the first great corporations, vital parts of capitalism's operating system, and spread their trading networks across the 7 seas. But first, a bit of definition. What's the difference between an herb and a spice? Herbs are primarily from the fresh, green, leafy parts of plants, which typically are from the temperate region, most of which are from the Mediterranean region. Spices, on the other hand, are derived from other plant parts, roots like ginger, bark like cinnamon, fruits like peppercorns, flowers like cloves. And spices, unlike herbs, are primarily from tropical regions, primarily from tropical Asia. The big exception is chili, red pepper, which comes from tropical America. Now, my mentor, Richard Schultes, who I've quoted many times in the course of this podcast, had something to say about the role of spices in our life. Schultes said, "Once people become accustomed to a luxury, they often consider it a necessity." This is true of a lot of items, not just spices. But spices is a case in point, because spices typically have no nutritional value, but when you get used to eating bland food to which spices have been added, you want more of those spices. But other luxuries, which we now consider necessities, range from salt to iPhones. Schultes was describing an important part of the human condition. Now, some of the first documentation of spices in use and the spice trade, where people traveled to different lands in search of plants and plant products that did not grow where they lived, were during biblical times. In this epoch, spices and herbs were integral to daily life, serving various purposes that spanned culinary, medicinal, religious, and even ceremonial domains. Their significance is well documented throughout the Bible, reflecting both their value and their diverse applications. As I said, they were used for culinary purposes, like they still are. But it's important to note that these seasonings not only added flavor, but also had preservative qualities, which were crucial in the absence of modern refrigeration. And recent studies have shown why so many of what we think of as the classic spices, that is the ones from Southeast Asia and chili peppers from tropical America, are antibacterial. In a tropical environment without refrigeration, food spoilage is that much more common. So the consumption of spices, or their addition to what you're consuming, has a health-giving role. Herbs and spices played a vital role in traditional medicine in biblical times. Two of the most important were myrrh and frankincense, which are resins, they're not spices, but they have proven antibiotic abilities. They're valued for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory properties. They're also used as analgesic, and the antibiotics of the ancient world, as we've discussed in an earlier episode, were frankincense, myrrh, and wine. These plants had religious and ceremonial applications. They had profound symbolic meanings and were central to various rituals. Anointing oil, a sacred mixture detailed in Exodus 30:23-25, composed of myrrh, cinnamon, cassia, and olive oil, was used to consecrate priests and holy objects. As incense, frankincense and myrrh in particular, as well as other aromatic resins, were burned in temples as offerings, symbolizing prayers ascending to heaven. Again, this is in Exodus. Also, burial practices. Spices such as myrrh were used to anoint bodies, as seen in John 19, where Nicodemus brings a mixture of myrrh and aloes to prepare Jesus' body for burial. These practices underscored the sanctity and reverence associated with spices in spiritual context. These plants and plant products also had economic and trade importance. The high value, particularly of spices coming from the Asian tropics, made them significant commodities in trade. The Queen of Sheba's famous visit to King Solomon, she gave him spices, gold, and precious stones, highlighting the esteem of spices in royal exchanges. This is in Kings in the Bible. Spices like cinnamon and cassia were imported from distant lands, establishing trade networks and the economic importance of these commodities. The demand for spices facilitated cultural exchanges and contributed to the wealth of trading nations. Spices held symbolic references in biblical terms. The Song of Solomon, the Beloved, is described with the imagery of spices, symbolizing beauty and desirability in the Song of Solomon. Proverbs, cinnamon and myrrh are mentioned to evoke themes of love and intimacy in Proverbs. Such symbolism enriched the poetic and allegorical expressions within the scriptures. Perhaps the first recorded instance of the spice trade involves the extraordinary Queen Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh who wore the false pharaonic beard. In 1485 BC, she sent an expedition of 5 sailing vessels down the Nile, through the Delta, and into a channel leading to the Red Sea, and then south along the East African coast until it reached Somalia, which was referred to then as the Land of Punt. So famous was this expedition that it's carved on her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari to honor and perpetuate her memory and this extraordinary expedition. The ships returned with 31 myrrh trees as well as other valuable commodities, including cinnamon, one of the classic Southeast Asian spices, as well as ebony wood, gold, silver, and myrrh. However, the first written record of spice trade from Southeast Asia dates to around 1485. Other reports suggest that as early as 2000 BC, cassia and cinnamon from China and Southeast Asia may have been transported from Indonesia to Madagascar in outrigger canoes along what Fred Rosengard refers to as the cinnamon route in his classic book, The Book of Spices. There are also early accounts of spices being traded in Mesopotamia, with ancient cuneiform records from the 2nd millennium BC mentioning their presence in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. The Code of Hammurabi, which was about 1700 BC, refers to the increased use of plant-based drugs in medicine. Nonetheless, India has always been a key player in the spice trade because, unlike Mesopotamia, it is the center of spice origin. That is because spices are native to India. Black pepper is native to the southwest coast of India, whereas none of these spices, only some of the herbs, are native to Mesopotamia. Around 1000 BC, one of India's great early rulers, Susrut II, S-U-S-R-U-T, compiled a list of 700 medicinal plants, highlighting India's deep connection to the trade. Between 331 BC and 641 BC, the uses of spices increased in Greece and then Rome, particularly after Alexander the Great expanded Greek influence into the lands of the former Persian Empire, including Egypt to the south. His conquest stretched from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India, including the Indus Valley. Greek settlements and commercial posts were established along the western section of the trade route, which later became known as the Silk Road. As part of his conquest of Egypt, Alexander the Great founded Alexandria, which would become the most important trading hub between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, serving as a gateway to the east and a meeting place for traders from 3 continents. The ancient Greeks imported spices from the east, particularly black pepper, cassia, cinnamon, and ginger, while also consuming many herbs from neighboring regions. Of the 400 herbal remedies used by Hippocrates, the father of medicine, about half are still in use today. Theophrastus, who we've mentioned in earlier episodes, he's known as the father of botany, was a student of Aristotle and a contemporary of Alexander the Great, wrote extensively about botany, including Asian spices, and recommended them for medicinal purposes. In the 1st century, Dioscorides, the leading Greek physician of his day, documented an enormous variety of medicinal plants, including several spices. The Silk Road, first used in the 1st century A.D., extended from China westward over the Pamir Mountains, P-A-M-I-R, mountains in Central Asia, reaching the Mediterranean. Before this, the incense route, used in an earlier period, ran from Yemen to Syria and Egypt during the time of Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century A.D. Pliny was known for complaining about the exorbitant prices of pepper, which had become an obsession for the Romans. During his area, Rome developed an active spice trade with southern Arabia, Somalia, and India. The high demand for spices, silk, gold, and gems led to a massive outflow of Roman gold to the east, draining the empire's treasury. The balance of trade with India was unfavorable to Rome, as evidenced by Roman coins still being found in southwestern India, particularly along the Malabar coast, where pepper is native. Pliny noted that by the time pepper reached Rome, it sold for 100 times its original cost. However, spices remained highly desirable for trade due to their small size, long shelf life, high value, and immense demand. During the reign of Emperor Claudius, of I. Claudius fame, and check out amazonteam.org/nutmeg for references to this great book and BBC film on the life of Claudius, a Greek merchant named Hippolus discovered the monsoon wind system of the Indian Ocean, realizing these winds reverse direction twice a year. This discovery allowed direct, faster voyages between the Red Sea and India, significantly reducing both travel times and costs. As a result, the Romans built larger ships and bypassed Arab middlemen, breaking the Arab monopoly on the Indian Ocean trade and creating even greater Roman demand for Indian goods. When Rome began trading directly with India, rather than relying on Arab merchants, it became the most extravagant consumers of spices in history. Spices were not limited to food, but were also used for fumigation, cosmetics, perfume, balms, and oil after bathing, since the Greeks and Romans primarily used a strigil, a scraping tool, rather than soap, which wasn't common in the ancient Mediterranean world. And since the Greeks and Romans had no deodorants, these perfume, balms, and oils were in great demand. These spices were also used in scenting lamp oil and were used in medicines. Spices were applied in poultices and healing plasters, primarily for their antimicrobial properties, as we mentioned earlier. This direct Roman-Indian commerce exposed the false claims of Arab traders who had previously maintained a monopoly by telling gruesome and frightening stories about how spices grew in caves guarded by giant birds and dragons. When Alaric the Goth king and conqueror besieged Rome in 408 A.D., he was well aware of the value of black pepper, which was worth its weight in silver. As part of the ransom to prevent the sack of Rome, he demanded 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 valuable animal skins, and 3,000 pounds of black pepper. Rome managed to meet these exorbitant demands, but in 410 BC, Alaric returned and successfully sacked the city, marking the beginning of the collapse of the Roman Empire. In 330 AD, Emperor Constantine founded Constantinople on the site of what had been known as Byzantium, which became the capital of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. As caravan and sea routes shifted to revolve around this new hub, two new spices, cloves and nutmeg, grown in the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands, became known in the West for the first time. The Arab domination of the spice trade, which was primarily between 641 and 1096 AD, began when the Muslim expansion cut off Rome's traditional trade routes. The Arab conquest shattered Mediterranean unity and disrupted commerce. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was not only a prophet and religious leader, but also an experienced spice merchant. As a young man, he worked for Meccan traders, dealing in spices, myrrh, and frankincense. He later became a caravan leader, married a wealthy widow in 595, and eventually began his prophetic mission. By the 8th century, the Islamic Empire stretched 7,000 miles from Spain to China. Muslim merchants and sailors spread Islam to Sri Lanka and Java in Indonesia, facilitating the expansion of the spice trade in Southeast Asia. So Islam went east and the spices went west. Thus, the spice trade bridged the remote islands of Southeast Asia with the desert kingdoms of the Middle East, linking cultures and economies for centuries to come. A bit more about the Roman Empire and the spice trade. For the Romans, the Mediterranean was the central hub for commerce. Roman traders began to encounter Eastern goods, including spices, through intermediaries such as the Greeks and the Phoenicians. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and resins like frankincense were introduced to Rome during this period, although their use was relatively limited and reserved for the wealthy elite. The expansion of trade began after 27 BCE, when the transformation of Rome from a republic to an empire under the great Augustus marked a turning point in Roman involvement in the spice trade. The Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability across the empire, allowed for the expansion of trade networks and the flourishing of commerce. The Roman Empire's vast territory, stretching from Britain to Egypt and from Spain to the Euphrates, provided a unified economic space where goods could move with unprecedented ease. It was during this period that the spice trade became a significant part of the Roman economy. The empire's acquisition of Egypt in 30 BCE, following the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, was crucial. Egypt, with its strategic position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean, became a key gateway for spices continuing from the east. The port of Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, emerged as a major center for the spice trade. From Alexandria, spices such as black pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and frankincense were transported across the Mediterranean to Rome and other major cities. The Romans primarily acquired these spices through trade routes that extended into the Indian Ocean, linking Roman merchants with the spice-producing regions of South Asia and Southeast Asia. Arab and Indian merchants played a vital role in this trade, acting as intermediaries who transported spices from the Malabar coast of India, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond. There are several excellent books on the spice trade covering these issues in great detail. I'm going to put those on the website, www.amazonteam.org/nutmeg. The spice trade was highly lucrative, and spices were among the most expensive and sought-after commodities in Rome. Pepper, in particular, was in high demand. Roman cooks used it as a seasoning in a variety of dishes, and it also became a symbol of wealth and status. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century, famously lamented the Roman addiction to spices, noting that Rome spent vast sums of money on foreign luxuries. Pliny's observations reflect a broader Roman concern about the outflow of wealth to the east in exchange for spices and other exotic goods. The principal overland route was the Silk Road, which linked the Roman Empire to China and India through Central Asia. However, the sea routes were even more crucial for the spice trade. Roman merchants traveled down the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula, where they met with Arab and Indian traders who had sailed from the spice-rich regions of India and beyond. However, as the Roman Empire began to decline through overexpansion and other problems, trade began to decline. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was facing significant internal and external challenges. Political instability, economic troubles, and invasions by various barbarian groups strained the empire's resources. The crisis of the 3rd century saw a decline in long-distance trade, including the spice trade. The Roman state, struggling to maintain its authority, imposed heavy taxes and regulation on commerce, further discouraging trade. Let me talk about what happened when the Roman Empire declined. As the Roman Empire declined, there was chaos across the land, and trade routes were broken or halted. In medieval Europe, black pepper became one of the most expensive commodities in the entire marketplace, so much so that it was used as a monetary source. Throughout Europe, individual peppercorns were accepted as currency to pay taxes, tolls, and rents, partly because of a coin shortage. Many European towns kept their accounts in peppers. With the coming of the Crusades, starting in 1095, international exchange of goods once again became common. Gradually, Asian spices such as pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cardamom became less expensive and more widely available. Spices were once again used to camouflage bad flavors and odors and for their health benefits. Spice wines also became very popular. European apothecaries used Asian spices such as ginger and nutmeg, as well as garden herbs in their remedies and elixirs. The remedies were largely based on Arabian medical training. At this point, European cultivation of spices and herbs was largely controlled by the church during this period. Religious spice and herb feasts were common. Some ancient customs and superstitions, such as tying bundles of herbs to keep the witches out, were also continued. However, this brought us to the age of exploration. One of the early pioneers, or even precursors, was the famous explorer Marco Polo, the Venetian who made his way to tropical Asia. He mentioned spices frequently in his travel memoirs, published around 1300 AD, and there is some anecdotal evidence that suggests that Polo's accounts led to an increased international spice trade during the 13th and 14th century. It was this growing demand for spices which led to the age of exploration launched by King Henry the Navigator, whose school at Sagres in Portugal led to Vasco da Gama's exploration of Africa around the Horn and then to India. At the time, the two major Italian commercial ports were Venice in northeastern Italy and Genoa in northwestern Italy. Venice became a middleman in the spice trade and grew very rich based on this economic advantage. However, if you believe the world is round and you're on northwest coast of Italy, you're at a disadvantage from people sailing to Southeast Asia from the northeast coast of Italy, that is the Venetians. So a Genoan by the name of Christopher Columbus, sponsored by the King and Queen of Spain, sailed east in search of spices. Spices were very much a part of the food staples brought to the American colonies by early settlers. And once the Americans had settled their dispute with the British, particularly after the War of 1812, they entered the world spice trade. They became major players. Salem, Massachusetts enjoyed a flourishing trade with the island of Sumatra in Indonesia. They profited immensely from the taxation and sales of these peppers. Most of the enormous quantities of pepper were then re-exported to European ports or were transferred to major American ports like Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore for processing and distribution by other American merchants and exporters. The scale of this trade was really quite titanic. Over 1 million pounds of pepper brought from Sumatra to Salem in 1886 were on one ship, the Eliza, a sailing ship of 512 tons. Americans continued with their love affair with spices, even through hard times. In fact, during the American Civil War, war rations included cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, and pepper. So wealthy did some members of the merchant class become in America that they were able to do good things with their fortunes. Eli Yale was a spice merchant who used his, or at least a part of his Titanic fortune, to endow a university, which we now know as Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut. Trade with the East was reopened by the Crusades in the 11th century. For 200 years, there was a stream of crusaders and pilgrims to the Holy Land, where they developed a taste for the foods of the warm climate and essentially rediscovered some of the spices which had been so prized by the Romans. Venice and Genoa became principal suppliers to the Crusaders and set up trading concessions in the Near East. These Italian city-states grew enormously in prosperity, and the bitter rivalry between them lasted until Venice defeated Genoa in 1380 and thereafter controlled trade with the Orient for more than 100 years. The Republic of Venice enjoyed an unprecedented boom in trade. The demand from Europe for spices, silks, and precious stones could probably not have been satisfied had the Indians and Chinese not wanted large quantities of gold, silver, coral, saffron, and wool in return from the Europeans. The first steps toward the discovery of new routes to the east were taken in 1418 when Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal set up the navigational school at Sagre in southwest Portugal. He sent expeditions down the west coast of Africa, hoping to find a route to the east. During his lifetime, the Portuguese did not succeed in getting there, but they brought back valuable cargoes from tropical Africa, including grains of paradise, which is a spice not well known in the modern day. In 1498, after a voyage of 10 months, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama reached Calicut on the western coast of India. After a stay of several months, he returned to Portugal with a cargo of spices and jewels, and the news that the ruler was willing to trade with the Portuguese. In 1500, Cabral followed with a larger fleet, although he took a wrong turn and discovered and took possession of Brazil for Portugal on the way, and a year later returned with a cargo of pepper and other spices. The Venetian monopoly was broken.
Thank you for joining us on this aromatic journey through history and plants of the gods. If you want to explore more about the powerful role plants have played in cultures around the globe, be sure to visit the Amazon Conservation Team's website at www.amazonteam.org.